Hello all. So in the last unit we have discussed about sentence classification task and sequential labeling. So we'll start with unit 3 wherein we'll discuss about sequence to sequence models. Okay. So far when we have discussed about sentence classification task, the input would be a sentence for which the output would be a label. For example, when you consider an NLP application of email filtering, okay, so the input taken for email filtering would be a sentence and the output would be a label which says whether the mail is a spam or not spam. Okay, now in the second part of the second unit we have discussed about sequential labeling, wherein we have discussed about two important tasks, POS tagging and NER, where the input is a sentence and the output are different labels. Okay, when we go for POS tagging we have parts of speech labels, and when we go for NER we have name entity recognition labels. Okay, so in this unit or in this session we would be discussing about sequence to sequence models where the input is a sentence and output is also a sentence. Okay, so when I talk about sequence to sequence model, I say they are the most important concepts in NLP which are important and complex too. Okay, so the reason why we call them as complex is because converting one sequence to another sequence in different language or in the same language, in the sense when you talk about text summarization. Okay, so until and unless we understand the entire context given in the input, we cannot be able to shrink that data into a short summary of that particular text, right? So sequence to sequence model is basically a complex are basically the complex model because they involve wide range of applications like text summarization, machine translation, voice recognition, etc. Okay, so when I talk about sequence to sequence models, there are different variations, because when I just talk about language translation, we have n number of languages which are used around the globe. So one language to another language translation, we have different variants. For example, when I talk about the only one nation, India, we have so many languages we use in India, and one language to another language conversion or vice versa will be one model, right? So we have different variations in the models, and these are the fundamental building blocks in many real world applications. When I talk about, as I told you, Google translation, speech recognition, text summarization, etc. Okay, so these are the three most important wide application that I want to discuss about. So first we have language translation, where the input is a sequence and the output would be a sequence generated again. Text summarization, maybe the length in the input and output may differ depending upon what application we choose or what exactly the operation we perform, but we have different in length of the input and output sequences. And chatbots. Okay, so every website, every app that we go, every company or any college, any institute, everywhere we find chatbots in the web app, right? So chatbots are another important applications of sequence to sequence model, where the input is a sentence and output is also a sentence. Okay, so we have already discussed about sequential labeling and language models, right? So what do we do in sequential labeling? We take a input sentence, and for that we generate POS tags. POS tagging and NER are two important applications of sequential labeling. So here POS taggings of each and every word are generated, and simultaneously we will also looked into language models which will generate the probability of the word prediction, right? So when I talk about sequence to sequence model or language translation, I need to predict the output sentence, and the probability of the words that are being converted also should be included, right? So when we have looked into these two models separately, we have seen sequence labeling model takes a sequence of some units, that is, it takes some words and assign labels. Okay, if it is POS tagging, POS tags, or if it is NER, name entity recognition modules would be added. Okay, but when I talk about language model, the language model takes sequence of some words and estimates how probable the sequence is in the domain when we are training that particular model. Okay, now when we look into these two sequences, two models, okay, so both are useful for number of NLP tasks. Okay, for some we may need the best of both. When I talk about best of both, I want sequential labeling along with language model. Okay, so we may want our model to take some input and generate something else, take one sequence and generate another sequence in response. Okay, for example, when I want to translate some text written in one language to another language, okay, so we need a model to take the sentence and produce another sentence as output. Okay, now can we do this with language models, or can we do with this only sequential labeling? The answer would be no. Why? Because they can produce only the same number of output labels as they are in tokens. Okay, so when I talk about sequential labeling, if I have 10 words, for 10 words I get 10 POS tags, right? So the tokens are same as the input sentence. So this is obviously too limiting for translation, because in translation the sequences of the input may be different from output. Okay, so one expression in language would be different in another. For example, in French we say hola, right? But in Telugu or Hindi we may have 2-3 words in that particular language, right? So the sentence's length would be different. Okay, so what do we do now? So in basically these two models are ready for translation, but not when used individually. Okay, so the model on the left, that is the sequential labeling, finishes processing the input sequence, that is the RNN. We use RNN for sequential labeling, right? So the RNN has already produces its abstract, which is encoded in the RNN's hidden states. Okay, so in this RNN hidden states we have the abstract which is being generated. Okay, so if we can simply connect the left block, that is the sequential labeling block, and the language model, okay, so we can design the sequence to sequence models. Okay, so the sequential labeling model takes the sentence as input and produces some form of representation, where the model on the right, that is language model, produces a sentence with variable length that looks like natural language text. Okay, so both these components individually can perform, but how do we do? By just connecting these two. Okay, so by the time the first model on the left finishes processing the input sentence, the RNN produces abstract which will be encoded, and then this particular sentence is passed from left to right to the language model block on the right hand side, which will generate the other sentence for the given input. Okay, so the basic idea behind the sequence to sequence model is to use one neural network model which will have encoder and decoder. The encoder block will encode the given input sentence and converts that into one fixed vector representation. Okay, the decoder block on the right hand side will take this fixed vector representation as input and converts that into the prescribed or required output sequence. Okay. Okay, so this is the simple architecture of sequence to sequence model. Now this consists of two important blocks. One is called as encoder block and the decoder block. As I told you, the encoder block will take words as input and converts this word into one fixed vector representation. Okay, now this fixed vector representation is taken as input by the decoder, which each and every word is being processed and converted to the required sentence. Okay, so an encoder takes the sequence of some inputs and converts it into some internal representation. This is what the internal representation is, and the decoder on the other hand will generate the sequence of other units based on the internal representation from the encoder block. Okay. Now, we have already seen 4 different types of RNN architectures: one to one, one to many, many to one, many to many. Okay. So, when I talk about sequence to sequence model, input is a sentence, output is a sentence with multiple words. So, for this case we will be using many to many type of RNN architecture. Okay. So, the many to many type of RNN architecture is used for building sequence to sequence model, because they will have the ability to work with variable length input sequences and convert that into another variable length output sequences. For example, if we consider the sentence I am doing good. Okay, so when you want to convert this sentence to another language, I have 4 words here. When I convert this into another language, I have only 3 words here. Okay, so your sequence to sequence model have the ability to handle variable length input sequences and variable length output sequence lengths. Okay, so basically the encoder block, when I talk about the encoder block, its main purpose is to process the input sentence and capture that fixed vector size. Okay, so the input sequence is put into the encoder, it processes the element of the input sequence word by word, and throughout this process the encoder keeps an internal state. Within the hidden state we have that functions which will convert the given words into vectors along with the compressed representation of the input sentence. Okay, so with this the context vector also captures the semantic meaning and important information of the input sentence. Okay, so finally once the context is captured, the final hidden state of the encoder is then passed to the vector of the decoder. Okay, now when we look into the decoder will receive both the context vector and the desired target. Okay, this is important again. Okay, so the decoder block will have the sample representation of the output along with this representation. Okay, this input and the predicted output. Okay, so the decoder block during inference, the decoder lies on its previously generated outputs and carry on with the subsequent steps. Okay, so basically the sequence to sequence model has the encoder block that is on the input side and the decoder block on the output side. Okay, so in the conclusion, as a whole, the sequence to sequence model basically takes a sequence and generates another sequence as output. Okay, so as with language models, the generation stops when the decoder produces a special token. Okay, so we have special tokens which we insert, which will enable the sequence to sequence model generate output that can be longer or shorter, that is variable length compared to the input sequence. Okay, so many variants of sequence to sequential model exist depending upon what type of application we are working on, that is different architectures for sequence to sequence model exist. Okay, so it all depends upon how does the information flow between that two blocks based on the application we are processing. Okay, so this is all about basic introduction to sequence models. Thank you.